Great. Well, first of all, I'm happy to be here and talk about some of the work we're doing in Alaska. And just start by saying, I think, like your organization and others like it are really, really important in the field of paleontology. And as you well know, there's a lot more non-paleontologists, professional paleontologists out looking for stuff than there are professional paleontologists. And if there weren't people like you out on the ground, hiking, exploring, hunting, fishing, and making these discoveries and sharing them with the scientists, we would have not nearly as much interesting and exciting things to say about this field. So thank you for all the stuff that you guys do. And case in point, and I'll just throw this in here quickly. Here's this crazy skull of Oregon's oldest fossil vertebrate. This is Bernie that Greg alluded to. And again, we were just really, really tickled that not only did Greg and his daughter find this and then want to share that, but Greg put a tremendous amount of effort and energy into preparing those bones over so many years. And that led to us being able to basically study that for a master's project to be completed on it. And then very soon, we hope to have a publication out on it, because it's a crazy, amazing animal. And so again, that's just a great example of how your work contributes hugely to our field. So thank you for that. I'm also glad you mentioned Ray and Kirk, because I've worked quite a bit with them over the years, and we've had some escapades up here in Alaska as well. And they're great, really great at sharing the science and connecting with lots of people from all over the country. So I'm glad to hear that you've got good connections with them as well. So today, what I was just going to do was tell you a little bit about what I do up here in Alaska a little bit. And I was trying to think of what I could talk about. As Greg mentioned, I used to do, most of my research was focused on marine reptiles from the Mesozoic, ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, things like that. Since I've been in Alaska, my effort has increasingly gone down the dinosaur path, and that's fine. I've been collecting dinosaurs for nigh on 30 years now as well, primarily in places like Montana, where I used to also live, Alberta, Colorado, all throughout the Western US and Canada. And so it's kind of natural when I came to Alaska to start working and looking for dinosaurs up here. And when I was first arriving in Alaska, frankly, we didn't know a whole lot about dinosaurs in the state. And fortunately, in the last several years, the amount of discoveries have really picked up. And the place right now that I would say is the coolest dinosaur locality, of course, I'm hugely biased here, in North America is the north slope of Alaska, and collecting in a formation called the Prince Creek Formation. And the stuff we find up there, it's very hard-won fossils, but the stuff we find is all really, really fascinating. So I'm going to tell you about one piece of that story that we published actually this year. And this has to do with the discovery of not just the fact that dinosaurs were living in the high Arctic 70 million years ago, but we now know that they were having babies up here. They were nesting and hatching eggs out in the Arctic 70 million years ago, which really forces us to sort of rethink a lot of things about dinosaurs. And now I'm glad to jump right into a Ray Troll bit of art here too. Ray, you've probably seen this, Ray and Kirk's latest book. This is the map of Alaska, and I worked for quite a while with Ray in putting together the information that he ultimately used in this illustration, which is fabulous. And really the story is there's fossils all over Alaska, and I work all over the state, and I'm happy to do so. But the area I'm going to talk about today, again, is just up in the northern area, what we call the North Slope. And the North Slope is really the part of the state between the Brooks Range and then up all the way to the Arctic Ocean. And it really is like a slope, because it's a tundra-covered wilderness. And the rocks that underlie the tundra are primarily composed of what's called this Prince Creek Formation. And it's a late Cretaceous formation. It actually extends into the Paleocene, so it crosses that extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous. And it's mostly the fossils that we're finding, and I'll talk about today, are around 70 million years ago. So I don't know how many of you may have had the joy of visiting northern Alaska. It is it's tundra, it's wide open, and it's an incredibly huge and expansive area on the North Slope. And if you fly over it, which you have to do because you can't walk over it, because you can see that tundra is absolutely impassable on foot, in at least most areas. The only way you can get around up there is by boat and by plane. And if you fly over it like this, looking down across the tundra, you might ask yourself, well, like, where's the rock? Where do you go and dig for fossils in a place like this? And the answer is, really the only place you can see these rocks to any extent is where rivers cut down through the tundra. They get through that part and then expose some of the bedrock. And the river, the largest river in northern Alaska is called the Colville River. And that's exactly what it does. It cuts right down and it cuts into rocks of the Prince Creek Formation, and actually another dinosaur producing formation that has mostly tracks in it called the Nunushiuk Formation, farther upriver. But the Colville really is, you know, our opportunity. It's our window into the Cretaceous in northern Alaska. And you can see in this view here, this little red dot in the middle, that's one of our boats. Our camp is located, we camped here for a night on this gravel bar. These gravel bars are our landing strips. We fly in by plane, we land on the gravel bars, we set up our boats, and then we move up and down river by boat. And that's how we get around. And it works pretty well, especially when the weather looks like this. Doesn't always look like this, of course. And the area we work is really about a 70-mile stretch of river. And it begins down at this little place called Umiat, which is an old oil settlement. It's not a community of people. It's just a settlement of one or two people sometimes in the summer. And it runs all the way downriver to what we call Ocean Point, which is where the Arctic Ocean tide actually affects the Colville River. So about 70 miles of river. Most of our work is down by Ocean Point. And when you're traveling down the river by boat, you know, this is really what you're seeing. This river is huge. And especially if the water is up, it's a very imposing bit of water. And these are the cliffs of Prince Creek Formation that you see. And it's from these rocks that we've been able to really find out more about polar dinosaurs than any place on the planet. So there are dinosaur fossils from elsewhere in the Arctic, and there are also some polar dinosaur sites down in places like Australia and Antarctica. But pound for pound, in terms of the amount of material and information, northern Alaska is where we are able to answer more questions about what dinosaurs were doing for a living 70 million years ago than anywhere on the planet. So it's really exciting that way. You know, right now, our list of dinosaurs over many years of field work that we've put together of who was there, it comes down to really a couple of the big common species you expect to find in dinosaur country from the late Cretaceous. So we have duck-billed dinosaurs. We have two types of duck-billed dinosaurs. One of them we named Agrunulus cookpicensis. There's another crested dinosaur that we haven't named yet. It's not as well known. We have a couple of small plant-eating dinosaurs. These are the Thescelosaurids. We have a large horned dinosaur. That's this thing here, Pachyrhinosaurus, a species unique to Alaska. And another smaller species we're just learning about called, it's related to Leptoceratops. It's a small version, kind of looks like Protoceratops if you're familiar with those. One type of pachycephalosaur known from a single bone, but still named Alaskocephaly ganglophi. And then amazingly, almost as many probable species of meat-eating dinosaurs or theropods as we have plant eaters. including a troodontid, 2 types of dromaeosaurs, 2 types of small carnivorous dinosaurs called Ricardoestesia, which we don't know much about, an ornithomimosaur, in other words, kind of an ostrich mimic dinosaur, and then 1 tyrannosaur, which has been named Nanuqsaurus hoaglandi. And that's a version of that here in the lower right-hand corner. So that's what we think is there. I mean, we know those species are there, but we've only named 4 of those species, but we know that there's more. But so far from what we can tell of all the stuff we've studied, not only are the 4 named species unique to Alaska, but we think all those other species probably are too. And for that reason, we actually named a distinct province of dinosaurs that lived up in the Arctic. We borrowed an Inupiaq term that means up north. And so we've called this the Panaktat province, which is a bit of a tongue twister. So don't say that after too many beers, but Panaktat province is the name that we've given to this distinct polar community of dinosaurs. And that's Ray Troll's, of course, take on that. Ray and Kirk came up to the North Slope with us back in 2012, I think it was, and had a visit. So here's what makes this area so important and so unique is basically, looking at a map here, this is North America, 70 million years ago. We've got a seaway, a shallow seaway running right up through the middle of North America, the Western Interior Seaway. And the landmass to the west here was called Laramidia. And so our Prince Creek Formation was being deposited way up at the northern end of Laramidia and not very far from the North Pole. In fact, in terms of the latitude it was at, was close to 80 to 85 degrees north latitude. That's 10 degrees farther north than it is today, which is at about 70. So this was not only the northernmost land on the planet, these were the northernmost dinosaurs on planet Earth that ever lived. So the fact that they were there at all is remarkable. And based on what we know from some other indicators from the plant fossils, we know that the temperature, though, in spite of that high latitude, was pretty warm. The temperature was about 6 degrees centigrade, which is around 41, 42 degrees Fahrenheit. So probably the climate temperature-wise wasn't too dissimilar to what it would be like in Southeast Alaska today. Now, if you compare that to lower latitude sites that are famous for dinosaurs, like in Alberta, the Horseshoe Canyon Formation, places like that still considered high latitude, but 58 degrees, maybe 60 degrees north latitude. It's a long way from the high latitudes that we were seeing these dinosaurs living at in Alaska, and much warmer with an average annual temperature up to as much as 20 degrees centigrade. But here's the biggest thing. If you're a dinosaur, and frankly, if you're a person living up here, if you're a dinosaur living at high latitudes, here's the biggest thing that influenced your life, and that's the light. And I speak from experience. I don't live at 80 degrees north, but I do live at 65 degrees north. And your seasonal attitude is hugely dependent on light. So if you were to make an annual cycle, basically a yearly cycle for that period of time, based on what we know for that latitude, there was about 120 days or close to 4 months of complete winter darkness that these animals may or may not have had to contend with unless if they lived there, they did, but maybe they migrated. I'm going to come back to that. But if they did live there, they would have had 120 days of winter darkness. That would have been followed by a very quick spring where the vegetative growth would have popped up. And then it would have had this amazing growing season for probably maybe 5-6 months. And then pow, really quick fall, leaf drop no later than October, and bam, you're back into another 4 months of complete winter darkness. That's a really challenging environment to live in. And as far as we know, no other dinosaurs on the planet lived in such a challenging light regime. So given that they dealt with, they had this environmental condition, it kind of makes you wonder, were dinosaurs actually capable of living year round in the Arctic? So some people have said, heck no, that's too rough. These are reptiles, for crying out loud. They must have migrated. So maybe they migrated, which would have been actually, upwards of 2,000 to 4,000 kilometers yearly in order to get down to lower latitudes, more light, more food. Alternatively, maybe they were just toughing it out and spending the entire year up at high latitudes. And if they did that, you know, it then suggests like, wow, they must have had to really contend with some pretty crazy winter conditions beyond the sort of things we normally think dinosaurs are capable of. So this has been a big, long-standing question. It doesn't just apply to the dinosaurs in Alaska, but dinosaurs that would have lived anywhere at high latitudes. And another big question people had is, you know, could dinosaurs even, were they even capable of reproducing in the Arctic? I mean, they're reptiles again, like, you know, today there are no reptiles in the Arctic, much less reproducing there at all. So how could dinosaurs have done that? Well, prior to our work, basically there was one site that suggested dinosaurs were reproducing at high latitude, but not as high as the Prince Creek Formation. And this is a site in Russia. It's very poorly studied. Just a handful of fossils are known, but its paleo latitude was 70, maybe 75 north, so above the Arctic Circle. But there are a few fragments of eggshell that suggested these dinosaurs were capable of nesting at fairly high latitudes. But could they live all the way up in the highest latitudes, like 80 to 85? So that question's been out there. Well, I'm here to tell you basically, they did nest in the Arctic. And based on the work that we've done now over the last 10 years at least, we now have basically baby dinosaurs from 7 different families of dinosaurs. So not just one species or 2 species, but probably at least 7 different species of dinosaurs were reproducing in the Arctic. And I use the term perinatal here because perinatal is just a fancy word for saying, when you look at baby dinosaurs that are so small that we're finding, we don't know if they were still in the egg and embryos or they had just hatched. So the term perinatal encompasses just before hatching and just after hatching. I'll just say the word baby a lot of the time, but some of them could have been embryos. And you can see from this penny for scale, the kinds of the fossils that we were looking for are absolutely minuscule. And when they're that small, it also makes them very hard to identify. So let me tell you a little bit about who we found and what the implications are for that. So to find these fossils, basically, we spent a lot of time in the field kind of doing a different kind of dig. So again, I mentioned we fly in by planes, we set up boats, we set up our camps right here on these gravel bars, which are great places to camp until the wind starts blowing, and then you're completely exposed. But we have no other choice. There's no trees to hide behind. And then over the years, you know, we go and collect at different sites. And one of the most famous sites from up there is called the Liscombe Bone Bed. This has been known since the 1960s, actually, but it wasn't really, nobody started to dig it until the 1980s and 90s. And the Liscombe Bone Bed is a bone bed layer full of probably tens, if not hundreds of thousands of bones of a duck-billed dinosaur. And not only are they from a duck-billed dinosaur, they're from almost entirely from juvenile duck-billed dinosaurs, which makes them harder to identify. Long story short, we now know that those juveniles are probably about 2 to 3 years old. They were probably a herd of animals traveling together from a basically one age class, this 2 to 3 year old age class, that were wiped out catastrophically and buried in this layer. And it's from those bones and other adult-sized bones from the formation, we were able to recognize a new species, which we named Grunelich kukpikensis. And that name, which is a bit of a tongue twister, it comes from the Inupiaq words, basically meaning the ancient chewer of the Colville River, because these are, of course, big plant-eating dinosaurs, and they have this big battery of teeth that they used for grinding plants. But we then began looking for new sites, and we've now found 3 really important new sites that are just producing a lot of amazing material, but they're not producing big bones. They're producing little bones. And the work that we do to excavate at these sites is really very slow and very painstaking. It's like digging a normal bone bed where you lay there and dig, but the bones you're looking for, you know, maybe the size of a pea or smaller. And they're so small that we also know we have to keep all of the sediment that we dig out from the few bones we find. And so these sites include places like Jacob's Bed, Paul's Pearls, and I heard somebody mention Tate. You might recognize JP Cavagelli there. He came up from the Tate one summer. So if you know him, that's JP, great guy. So what we do is then, after having fun laying there on the permafrost, digging out the bones, we save all this sediment, and then we screen it there in the river, which is, you know, 34-degree water. And we stand there on the edge of the river and we screen try to get as much of the muck out of there, and we screen it out and bring back buckets and buckets and buckets of sediment. And it's in these sort of sites that we begin to find our little baby dinosaur bones. And in fact, what we actually have to do is look at every single grain of sediment under a microscope in order to find some of the smallest fossils, which you'll see in a minute are literally no bigger than the head of a pin. Now, I just want to make mention of this one site. It's called Ojesaurus, and you can see it's a site halfway up a cliff. Oops. And this has been one of the sites that's produced some really, really cool stuff. But unfortunately, the one summer we tried to dig there, we realized this slope is too unstable to dig safely in the summer because the only thing holding that cliff together is permafrost. And in the summer, that permafrost melts back enough that the cliff becomes unstable and the whole thing can slump down. And it can kill you in a second. And even if it doesn't kill you when it falls on you, it'll push you into the river and drown you. So it's not a good place to dig in the summer, which is too bad because the bone bed in there is the best dinosaur bone bed in the state of Alaska. So we said, we got to get up there. We got to dig this layer out. It's too important. It's got meat-eating dinosaurs. It's got babies. It's got new species of plant-eating dinosaurs. How do we get there? Well, the answer is you go in the winter. So last winter, we started doing winter digs because we knew that that cliff would be frozen solid and safe. And in fact, we don't have to fly in planes, and that's safer. We don't have to use boats, and that's safer. But we do have to actually get ourselves up there and get to the site. And that involved the use of snow machines and a lot of complicated logistics. But last winter we snow machined, we drove out to an oil pad owned by the ConocoPhillips. And then we ended up snow machining 30 miles out to the river to our dig site. And we dug in some pretty cold weather. And basically what we did is we set up a quarry on the cliffside. And the way we got the frozen rock out was basically just using jackhammers or demolition hammers really, and chainsaws designed to cut through rock. And that's how we cut blocks of the bone bed out, frozen solid. You don't need any we also had some, we had a 4-day blizzard that didn't help things either. But at the end of the day, we managed to remove several blocks of rock, frozen rock that we were then, and we are now right now currently cleaning up, looking for and finding some really cool stuff in there. So that's field work in Alaska for you. Got to be creative. So what do we find? Well, first of all, we found a lot of baby bones. Now, these little bones I'm showing you here, I'll put in a scale bar in just a second, but you notice that they're babies because they're very porous. They look like somebody sort of pricked them with a pin. That's a that bone texture is very typical of baby juvenile animals, whether they be mammals, birds, dinosaurs, you name it. But here's the scale bar to go with it. So there's a head of a pin. That pin head is 1.5 millimeters in diameter. So this vertebra actually is recognizable as the tail vertebra from a meat-eating dinosaur. And you can see it's only about 2 millimeters wide. Very hard to see. And then these many bones, like these vertebrae, are also extremely small, as small as a millimeter across. And that's actually probably from a plant-eating dinosaur. We can't be sure, but well, I know it's from a plant-eating dinosaur. I don't know if it was a duck-billed dinosaur. Some of the bones were really, it was also possible to tell that they were babies because we can do thin sections and look at them under a microscope. And they have a number of features in thin section that tell us that are very typical of babies. Again, whether they be baby dinosaurs or mammals, they're full of a lot of holes, which were little canals for blood vessels and nerves. And so we know that this bone was growing very rapidly, and that's very typical of babies. And there's a number of other little more detailed features as well. But the histology is very important in determining that these aren't just small animals as adults, these are small because they're babies. We even found some new teeth, and these are large teeth of a species of dinosaur that we didn't know was up there. And this is, I mentioned, this new kind of dinosaur we didn't even know was in the Arctic until a few years ago. And it's closely related to this thing called Leptoceratops. This is the first occurrence of them known in the Arctic, really strange. And lo and behold, we also found some extremely small teeth that probably belong to this species. And so here is one of those teeth again, 1.5 millimeters across. You know, if you've got a ruler handy, I've got a ruler handy right here, actually. You know, 1.5 millimeters across is kind of like the width of a well-sharpened pencil, the lead of a well-sharpened pencil. I mean, it's really bloody small to find these things. We found them from the upper and the lower jaw. They have different kinds of teeth in their upper and lower jaw, which is kind of cool. And one of the reasons we knew that these were babies, and this is a process we used for the other ones as well, is we compared the size of these teeth to dinosaurs that have been collected from baby dinosaurs that have been collected within the egg. So they're known embryos. And there is a relatively close relative called Protoceratops, known from Mongolia. We have baby Protoceratops in the egg. And when we compare the size of its teeth to the size of our Leptoceratopsid, which, by the way, they're about the same sized animals as adults, our teeth actually from Alaska are smaller than the embryos, the known embryos from Mongolia. So these were very, very, very small teeth, very small critters. And I'll just run through a few other things we found there. We knew that there was a plant-eating dinosaur called, two types of Thescelosaurid dinosaurs. This is a very distinctive kind of tooth from the cheek region. And we have baby teeth from those as well. Again, tiny, about 1.5 millimeters across. There's a close-up look at that. Unnamed species yet. We, of course, had teeth from duck-billed dinosaurs, the most common dinosaur we find up there. And some of these teeth were almost absolutely certainly from embryos based on the size of the teeth. Meat-eating dinosaurs like Troodontid, here's an adult-sized tooth. Here's the baby-sized tooth. These were really important to find these teeth because they helped us actually really more specifically identify who was here. So these are baby Troodontid teeth, really cool. These are, by the way, the smallest dinosaur teeth from all of these groups of dinosaurs known in North America. I'll just say that. Pachyrhinosaurus, the plant-eating, big plant-eating horned dinosaur. We have lots of horned dinosaurs in North America, tons. These are the smallest horned dinosaur teeth ever found in North America. And these were also very small animals. And actually we found, since this slide was made, even smaller teeth. And even tyrannosaurs. This is a very distinctive tooth from the upper jaw called the premaxillary tooth. It's kind of a chisel tooth thing. We also found one of these from a baby Nanuqsaurus, a baby tyrannosaur, smallest tyrannosaur teeth in North America. Crazy. All this from Alaska, who knew? And finally, the cool thing we found up there unexpectedly, we started to find the first bird bones from the Arctic ever found, but not only that, we found the first perinatal bird bones from the Arctic. In other words, these little bones, which are distinctively bird, this is the, the tarsometatarsus from the foot. This is the oldest evidence for birds breeding in the Arctic anywhere on the planet. Today birds, many species of birds make that long migration to the Arctic to reproduce in this seasonally abundant habitat. Well, guess what? They've been doing it for probably at least 70 million years. So when you put all this story together, what you end up with is kind of this, you can go back to this question again, is like, okay, we've got baby dinosaurs, we've got animals absolutely reproducing in the Arctic. But remember, we talked a little bit about those crazy environmental conditions. So, if were they migrating, given what we know about them reproducing, were they actually migrating to get out of there in the winter? And the short answer to the long explanation is basically no. We are pretty certain now that these animals were year-round residents and did not migrate. One of the biggest reasons, of course, look at the size of these baby dinosaurs. How do you get an animal like that in its first year of life to undertake 2,000-3,000 kilometer migration? Doesn't make a lot of sense. Another big thing has to do with the fact that, there wasn't much of a decent growing season up there. And I mentioned before that if they, unlike dinosaurs that lived at lower latitudes, these animals were not capable of just reproducing at any time of the year. Almost certainly, the winter months would have been totally impossible to lay eggs or even incubate eggs. So the only reproductive window they had was about 8 months, maximally, probably only more like 6. And here's the coolest thing that we found out is that we now know how long it takes for some kinds of dinosaurs to incubate the egg. So from laying to hatching, we know how long that takes in 2 different groups of dinosaurs. One of them is Protoceratops, the one I showed you before, closely related to our Leptoceratops. And the other one is for a duck-billed dinosaur from Alberta called Hypacrosaurus. To make a long story short, we know that dinosaurs incubated their eggs for a long time. They aren't like birds in this regard. They actually have long incubation periods, comparable to more like living reptiles and not like birds, which have relatively short incubation periods. So think about it this way: if you're a dinosaur and you're living and reproducing in the Arctic, let's say you were migrating. Okay, you would have only arrived probably just when things started to get light again and the first vegetation showed up. Okay, let's say you laid your eggs then as soon as you could in the new year, which would have been around late March, early April. Again, remember again what we said about the vegetation. Probably all the leaves had dropped by the beginning of October. So if you laid an egg and you were a dinosaur like our Leptoceratops, the fastest you would have been hatching eggs is in July. But more importantly, if you're something like a duck-billed dinosaur with nearly a 6-month incubation period, you wouldn't have begun hatching out of the egg until September, which means then this tiny little dinosaur would then have had to have undertaken immediately a very long migration to low latitudes, which we think is highly improbable. So the bottom line here is these dinosaurs, they weren't, they were year-round residents of the Arctic. They lived up there, they reproduced up there, and somehow they endured the winters up there. And really that's kind of the next set of questions now that we're going to be moving into is, now that we know that they were year-round residents, how did they do that? Like, did they hibernate? Like some of the species are small enough, maybe they hibernated. What kind of special food resources did they use in the winter months? Were they eating bark and logs? How did they stay warm? I mean, some had feathers, but did all of them have feathers? We don't know. And then like, how did they deal with the dark? Did they have special vision, hearing? These are the kinds of things that we're still working on today. But anyway, this is an ongoing project. We've been up there now for over a decade doing this work. We'll be up there. We're going to be up there again this winter. So we have another winter dig planned at that same site, and hopefully we'll get up there in the summer as well. But anyway, that's that's kind of what we've been doing up here. So I'm happy to entertain some questions.
Yeah, so Pat, you mentioned something 70 million years ago, and I'm thinking of the high and low temperatures. For instance, in the wintertime, of course, what would be the low in that anticipated low in during the winter, the peak of winter, and the high and the peak of summer.
Right, and let me just show you, we actually have some numbers for that here. So one of the cool things about some of the plant studies that are done and have been done in the Arctic up there is that you can determine what's called the warm month mean temperature and the cold month mean temperature. Because you're absolutely right, a mean annual temperature, you could get the same mean annual temperature for two sites that have extremely different average, variations of temperatures in the year. And so the question is what was that seasonal variation like? So the warm month mean temperature, it was fairly warm, 14 degrees centigrade. I mean, that's pretty toasty for the Arctic. But the cold month mean temperature suggests sub-freezing temperatures. And in fact,
-2 degrees.
some of those temperatures actually I've seen estimates for are even quite a bit colder than that. So the bottom line there is these dinosaurs were experiencing not just darkness, but they were experiencing freezing conditions in snow. So, putting your brain around this image of a dinosaur traipsing through the snow is a little different than we grew up thinking about.
So Gerald, the method that's used to determine warm month mean temperature and cold month mean temperature, that's called CLAMP. There's actually Jack Spicer, who's the one that it was started by, I believe it was started by Jack Wolf, but Jack Spicer really promoted it a lot. His CLAMP website actually has the algorithm on there, so you can plug in your own leaf data set for it. It can also spit out other variables like paleo elevation and also precipitation as well, and when those precipitation seasons are happening. Do you know how well, this is a question for Patrick, do you know how well because there's calibration data sets that you have to use for that. Are there any Arctic data calibration sets that they have used for that?
Most of this work was done by Spicer. So, this is where I'm
okay. Okay, so I that makes sense. I trust his work, so I know he would know if they were missing some modern data to compare it for. So I would assume if he did it, he would know that. That it's valid. That it's valid. Yeah.
There's an even better plant. Plant data set, fossil plant data set from Denali National Park, where I also work. It was called the Cantwell Formation. And one of the former PhD students here, Susie Tomzik, actually did a clamp analysis on that flora as well. And interestingly, she came up with a mean annual temperature of 7 degrees centigrade, which makes sense because it's about 7 degrees actually farther south in latitude. Coming up with very comparable numbers, different study sites, and they seem to jive pretty well.
Yeah, that's reassuring. That's pretty good. This coming summer, hopefully there's going to be a group of us from Florida coming up. But there's a big botany conference that's going to be in Anchorage. So I know further south than Fairbanks, but maybe we'll get a chance to go up to Fairbanks as well.
Oh yeah, so, please do. That's great. Yeah, awesome.
Harold Haynes here. I'm going to be a bit of a skeptic here.
Okay, please do.
I'm not convinced by your argument. First of all, I'm really struck by the assemblage of both meat-eating and plant-eating babies all in the same, perhaps, nesting site, which suggests an abundance of food and they're not competing perhaps much. But I guess you found absolutely no large dinosaur bones, correct?
When you say large dinosaur bones, you
Any
mean,
adults, any adults?
we have lots of adult bones, yes.
Oh, you do have, so you're only showing us the baby stuff today.
Yeah, we do. And so we have, most of what we know, the occurrence of these families of dinosaurs there is based first and foremost on adult-sized remains that we've known about for a while, some from bones and some from teeth. But
you know, on site, you found large adult bones.
so we do have both
Same place
adult
we
and
found-
baby-sized bones here. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I mean, today we see a pattern of migration into that zone during the summer,
Mhm.
and a breeding period that's fairly intense. Now, you kept referring to them as reptiles, but there's a lot of evidence now for, is there not, for warm-blooded dinosaurs and therefore much higher metabolism rates.
Mhm.
And so,
Yeah.
so I've assumed that we're looking at that sort of situation. Um,
Absolutely.
And so migration over an extended period of time. Also, there's a whole question of the rate at which the babies grow. And therefore, species vary tremendously in terms of their ability at birth to be mobile and fairly quickly mobile. So yes, it's a reasonable assumption that indeed these small dinosaurs are able to travel at a fairly early age. And therefore, there could have been a migration pattern.
Yeah, well, you raise a lot of good points. I'll try to hit on some of those here. First of all, about the warm-bloodedness and so they are reptiles, true, but we've actually done growth series on our duck-billed dinosaur up here. And we know from those kinds of histological analyses that these have a growth rate that's comparable to that of very close relatives at lower latitudes, which, you know, there's a huge body of evidence now that suggests dinosaurs were warm-blooded in the broad sense of the term. It doesn't mean that they were doing exactly what a bird or a mammal does today, but pretty clearly they were endotherms. They were generating their own heat. They were homeotherms. They were maintaining a high body temperature. And so these dinosaurs were almost certainly no exception to that. They were, to some degree, I'm happy to call them warm-blooded. And I think that's one of the critical things that actually enabled them to live at those latitudes. And that would suggest potentially an ability to, from, like you say, get up and go pretty early at a young age. So because they grew rapidly, so like birds today, some dinosaurs were altricial and some were precocial. Like the precocial ones could get up and go pretty quickly. And that's probably what some of these dinosaurs did. Although some of the altricial species previously have been interpreted to be things like duck-billed dinosaurs. But even if they were precocial, I think there's a real question about the energetics of how, from a very young age, you would have been able to have moved a great distance. And the distances that have been proposed in order just to get to the Paleo-Arctic Circle are greater than the distances traveled by things like caribou today, which undertake they undertake the longest terrestrial mammalian migration of any animal on the planet. And they have to go quite a long ways, but by the time that those young calves have been born and raised and make that migration, they're already somewhere like 60–70% of adult body size. Our guys, we're talking about an 18-inch long dinosaur that's going to be a 25-foot long dinosaur. So I think we still have an energetics problem, really. Yeah, but you're good points. I mean, because who knows what. And here's another point that you bring up that's really good. Migration is also a term that should be used carefully. We in the paper always refer to this as long distance migration. What caribou do today in the Arctic is they migrate, but they're not migrating north and south. You know, they migrate more east to west. Their winter migrations, summer migrations, they're based around food resources and not temperature. And there's no reason why some of these dinosaurs were not undertaking some kind of local movement seasonally. I have no problem with that. And in fact, they may have even been going closer to the ocean in the winter, which the Arctic Ocean at that time was unfrozen and probably was, for that reason, a warmer place to be than inland. So they could have undertaken at least some degree of movement, but we just don't think it was a huge migration to low latitudes as kind of traditionally envisioned.
But so we've got all these herbivores.
Yeah.
Was the vegetation mostly conifers, or would it been mostly flowering plants, or both?
It was both at that time.
Grasses.
It was based on, so the dominant species were Metasequoia and relatives. These were conifers. They were deciduous conifers, so they
Right.
lost their needles every year. And they were probably the largest elements of the flora, but there were also definitely broadleaf plants. So flowering plants were there, and they had more than likely they were not nearly as tall as these like Metasequoia like species, small trees, shrub sized. And then the understory was probably dominated by ferns and horsetail relatives like equisetum like things. And actually equisetum rhizomes and stem pieces are not uncommon in some of these sites. In fact, they're pretty darn common in some of these sites. But it's pretty impressive when you're floating on the Colville River at 70 degrees north in a boat, and you get out of your boat and you step off into some Cretaceous rocks and you pick up a tree trunk this big around, a petrified log of like Metasequoia or its close relatives. I mean, that's pretty telling a little bit about the kind of world of the Cretaceous. This polar forest. I mean, those are two words that shouldn't go together, polar forest, but that was the world these dinosaurs lived in.
Pat, a question, and because I was looking at that layer of where you were finding the all those teeth, particularly, and what is that? I mean, it seems like there's a lot of things that have died there. There's a lot of individuals, so it's a very heavy concentration of dead babies, or at least that's what my gathering is. So what was the settlement they were in? Was it flood material or glacial aspects, or?
Yeah, good question. So I mentioned that the Liscombe bone bed with the bone bed with both mostly babies, but some adult remains in it. That was a catastrophic event, pretty clearly. The sites that we're digging this new stuff out of very different depositional setting. And in fact, what we're seeing is that these are probably, for just in simplest terms, I mean, these were lag deposits. These were the bottoms of stream channels where that collected heavier particles, including bones and teeth, that were falling in basically into these rivers that were eating away at their banks and basically incorporating in all this riverbank mud.
Right.
The coarser material was getting left behind as the fines were winnowed away by the channel itself. So when we find these beds, we're actually finding them at the bottom of a sandstone unit, a channel sand, what we call, it's definitely some sort of a channel sand. And these bone beds, they're only like 5 centimeters, maybe 10 centimeters thick, where these little babies are. They're located in those types of settings. So we're interpreting those as these basal lag deposits. Yeah. And so those animals, what we're seeing then is an accumulation of critters that died over decades, if not centuries. Yeah. But definitely close to nesting grounds.
Yeah.
They couldn't have been transported very far.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
They didn't find any shells, though, eggshells. Did they all dissolve away?
Yeah, basically. We've still not found any eggshell. I'm sure we would have. I mean, when you go grain by grain through a couple of tons of sediment and you find these other things. If there had been some eggshell there, I'm sure we would have found it. But I think what happened is the soil chemistry was too acidic and the eggshell just simply didn't survive. The geochemistry was not conducive for preservation.
That would make sense if you had a lot of metasequoia or deciduous conifers, because a lot of deciduous conifers in general are just very acidic and will, you get spogisol from that. So that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree totally. I think that's it's all that pesky rotting plant stuff was not helping things like eggshell, which is only pure calcium carbonate instead of bones, which are calcium phosphate and a little more resistant. Yeah.
So I sort of have two questions. The first one is Harold got me thinking. So I haven't kept up with the dinosaur literature, sadly. So when you're talking about homeothermy and stuff, where does it stand then with the respiratory turbinates for some of those studies that looked at like homeothermy with regards to dinosaurs?
Yeah, that was a line of inquiry that was used for a while. It's not there. It hasn't, dinosaurs don't seem to have anything like what mammals or birds have, especially mammals. Nothing quite like that.
Yeah.
So that one didn't, that one kind of
Didn't
fizzled.
Stand the test of time, so to say. Yeah. All right. So and then my other question was, I remember relatively recently there was a therizinosaur found in Alaska. Where is that in relation, both geographically and stratigraphy wise, with this site?
Yeah. So the other big right now, the other main dinosaur site that we're working on in the state is Denali National Park. And that is a site that is entirely, well, okay, it isn't anymore because but it's mostly tracks. And it's actually one of the biggest Cretaceous dinosaur track sites in North America. It's amazing. And another researcher who's worked in the park several years ago described, based on a single footprint, what they interpreted to be a therizinosaur footprint, and so if you're not familiar with therizinosaurs, these are these Edward Scissorhand dinosaurs. They're a group of meat-eating dinosaurs that they actually don't have teeth, but they have very, very long claws on their forearms, like it's just bizarre animals. So one interpretation for that footprint, and there's been a few more like it found, is that it's a therizinosaur. Personally, I'm not convinced. I found several myself. I think there's some other options that need to be explored there a bit. But what's really cool about the Denali site, it's slightly lower latitude. It's about 7 degrees lower latitude than the Prince Creek, but the rocks are pretty close in age and they overlap a bit. And for that reason, what I've been doing with my research is using the body fossils, the bones and teeth from our Prince Creek dinosaurs to tell me a little bit about who was making the tracks down in Denali. But of course, because there's so many more footprints than there are bones that we'll ever find, we're finding types of footprints in Denali that are telling me about the dinosaurs up north in the Prince Creek. So it's been a great, both of them go really hand in hand with each other, and it's more powerful to have both of them together.
Yeah, got it. And then so the Denali stuff, that's at display down at some of it's displayed at the Perot Museum, right? Down in Dallas. Okay.
That's right.
Yep. I saw it this summer. So
oh, you did? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just the stuff on display didn't go into collections. So yeah. Thank you.
Sure, you bet.
Other questions?
I can only see a few boxes, so if you're raising your hand, I probably can't see you.
Speak up if you guys have questions. That may be it. Up there in Alaska, I'm not muted anymore. Up there in Alaska, how is it very populated where you're doing your work? Are you at the university? Do you have a lot of public outreach there? Like, I'm just thinking whether or not you have a museum at the facility and whether people come and visit, or is it more desolate and you don't see a lot? What kind of public outreach you guys have up there?
Yeah, fortunately, so I'm the director of the museum here. And so we get about 90,000 visitors a year. Well, pre-pandemic, 90. Yeah, so we have quite a bit of story. Our museum is really kind of the de facto natural history museum for the state. And so I'd encourage you to come up and visit at some point. It's a fantastic facility. And so we are also a cultural museum as well. And so we have a mix of natural and cultural history and art. So we do a lot in one place here. And so I do have some of this dinosaur material is on exhibit. And so that's a cool, kind of a cool way that we're able to share some of this. I also work a lot with the Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management, and help them with outreach in a variety of different ways. I've also commissioned a bunch of new art for telling some of these stories as well, which I know have made the rounds on the web pretty well, so that a good artist is worth their weight in gold, because they can do so much to tell a story that it's so hard to communicate otherwise. And so Ray Troll has done quite a bit of art. There's another artist, James Havens from Anchorage, who's done some really great art as well. Yeah, so we try to get the story out there.
Thanks for answering that. Any other questions or? All right, well, thank you so much, Pat, for taking the time to talk to us about that. It's fascinating. And
You bet.
yeah.